the main US interference is coming through constant bombardment on social media of illegal disinformation and violation of Brazil's laws and hate speech, which is also illegal in Brazil. This constant 24/7 bombardment of disinformation that's being spread with money from some of the richest business people in Brazil through hundreds of thousands of WhatsApp groups, through other social media platforms, through Telegram. And this is really destabilizing the government.
Hello and welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan, and every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. This month is our fundraising month for the year ahead, so please donate. There's many links below. You can also become a paid patron on our Patreon, or else just share our work and comment. That will help too. So we are so happy to introduce our amazing guest today to the Global Majority for Peace podcast, Brian Mier. Brian Mier is a sociologist and geographer, Brazil correspondent for TeleSur English, and co-host of Globalistas on TV 247. He has written extensively for Brazil Wire, FAIR, FAIR, COHA, Truth Dig, Geopolitical Economy Report, Carta Capital, Outras Palavras. His Substack is Delinking Brazil. Wow, that was a huge resume and a huge mouthful for me, and I apologize for all the mispronunciations. But this will be in the description below so people will actually know these outlets. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
So we do like to begin this podcast on more of a personal note. Could we start with you telling us about the origin of your politicization? Was there a particular incident that led you to your worldview?
First of all, my father was a naval engineer in Vietnam, and he was a conservative Republican when he was deployed there in 1967, and he came back as a Marxist-Leninist and then got involved in the anti-war movement. And he and my mother adopted my little sister. She was a GI orphan in Vietnam. And so when I was a really little kid, we used to have these North Vietnamese propaganda posters all over our house and stuff. And I used to overhear conversations. And then in Brazil, where I've been living for almost 30 years now, what got me, I think a lot of people got kind of confused in the 90s about politics and stuff like that. And then as someone who'd kind of come out of the second wave punk movement in Chicago in the early 80s, I kind of had some anarchist sympathies just because I hadn't thought things out properly. But for a while, I was working for an NGO called Action Aid Brazil, and some of the projects I managed was one with the landless rural workers movement for 4 years, and another with the urban social movements, the 4 largest urban squatters movements in Brazil. And in that process of interacting with them, I developed a much more sophisticated take on Brazilian politics. And one specific thing that stands out is I spent 3 weeks on loan to the MST, interpreting for 2 of their national directors, Maria Gorete and Divina, in an African social movements conference outside of Durban for 3 weeks in 2008. And just this all day long process of like simultaneously interpreting for those 2 brilliant women really helped develop my politics from a global South perspective, for sure.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. You were also an editor and writer at Brazil Wire when it gained prominence for covering US's involvement in Lula da Silva's wrongful conviction and imprisonment in 2018. Brazil Wire was also instrumental in highlighting the international significance of Lula da Silva's political comeback. On January 8th, 2023, exactly 1 week after Lula's inauguration, Brazil experienced what many are calling a US-backed attempted coup. Could you provide your analysis of what happened and your assessment of how successful Lula's strategies are in staving off US interference?
Okay, in this case, I would say US extended state. It was one part of the extended state that supported and one part of the state that defended, okay, in this case, because of the political conjecture, the same democratic administration that was responsible for initiating Operation Car Wash, which resulted in Lula's frivolous, arbitrary political imprisonment and removal from the 2018 elections, directly leading to the Jair Bolsonaro presidency, that process backfired for the Democrats, and they ended up with a very strong Trump ally in the White House. They were expecting the PSDB party to take control, which was this kind of like Clintonian, Democrat-friendly political party that actually imploded during the whole process because the center-right just went to the far right. And so we had a situation in which, through years of very close contact between the Bolsonaro family, specifically their son Eduardo, and Steve Bannon and Trump's people, Mike Lindell, these kind of figures in the United States, Bolsonaro had spent 3 years preparing preemptively a stop the steal narrative, very similar to the one that Trump did. Except Trump was saying the US needed electronic voting, and Bolsonaro was saying the opposite. The electronic voting is horrible. Brazil needs paper voting, right? Just nonsense. But anyway, they'd spent 3 years preparing to reject the election results, and the military who made up part of Bolsonaro's coalition, including General Walter Braga Neto, who's on trial right now, General Augusto Helena, who was in charge of Ministar military in Haiti during the Sicily massacre. A group of these military went both to Russia they got in touch with Russia and the United States governments and asked them for support if they rejected the election results and held an auto coup. This is according to a pretty well-known journalist in Brazil who wrote this at the time in November, I think, of 2022. Both governments told them no. And so at this point, the Brazilian army, pulled out of supporting Bolsonaro and refused, The army in Brazil is twice as big as either the Navy or the Air Force. So even though the Air Force and Navy commanders continued to support Bolsonaro's idea of an auto coup, with the army pulling out, it pretty much weakened the entire process. Bolsonaro fled the country a couple of weeks before his mandate ended, turned over the reins to his vice president, and was sitting there in Florida watching the incursion on January 8th. That day, basically what they tried to do was, let me go back to Inauguration Day first, January 1st. What was interesting about January 1st is that both Russia and US government sent snipers to help with the security for Lula's inauguration. It was like the only time in years that Russia and the US collaborated on something, which is really, really bizarre. So on the 8th, basically what they tried to do was, through their mapping out of sympathetic lower-level military commanders and the National Highway Police and the Federal District Military Police, they basically tried to force Lula's hand and get him to declare a state of siege or a state of martial law, a national state of emergency. According to Brazilian law, this would have turned security of Brazil over to the military. And they were hoping that at that point, the army would get back on board, even though there were a few lower-level army colonels in charge of troops and things who were already collaborating by refusing orders, for example, to shut down protest camps in front of their bases, refusing to let the federal police arrest protesters in front of their bases and stuff like that. But these weren't orders from the top of the army. The army refused to go on board. But to Lula's credit, on that day, he didn't fall for the trap. He didn't declare a state of siege. as local police officers were just like opening the doors to let these rioters come in, and it was much better organized than what happened on January 6th in the United States on Trump inauguration. They went right into the intelligence headquarters office and stole a bunch of hard drives, and they stole weapons from the weapons stockpiles. They knew what they were doing in there. At the same moment, 17 high tension towers were sabotaged across the country, leading to blackouts in different towns and cities. So it was like a better coordinated operation. But Lula refused to call a state of emergency. He just called in the federal police. The federal police came in and shut everything down in like half an hour, just throwing tear gas grenades and, showing that it would have been easily prevented if the local police hadn't opened the doors basically and refused to do anything to try and stop the rioters. Now, that guy who was in charge of the federal district security at the time was Jair Bolsonaro's former national security director, and he's one of the people who's been indicted for participating in this coup attempt.
That's really interesting. I actually didn't know that much about that, like the parallels to January 6th.
It was like a better organized version of the same thing.
Yeah, I would say, just say the January 6th thing was quite tumultuous, to say the least. What is your assessment of Lula's strategies at staving off US interference now? How is he navigating through?
Well, he's having a tough situation because the main US interference is coming through constant bombardment on social media of illegal disinformation and violation of Brazil's laws and hate speech, which is also illegal in Brazil. This constant 24/7 bombardment of disinformation that's being spread with money from some of the richest business people in Brazil through hundreds of thousands of WhatsApp groups, through other social media platforms, through Telegram. And this is really destabilizing the government. On top of that, the Workers' Party, even at the height of Lula's popularity in the early 2000s, the Workers' Party's never held more than 22% of parliament. And these days it's got about 13%. Its total coalition is around 16% parliament, maybe. That's the inner circle. And then you have a looser governing coalition, which is made up of several center-right parties, some of which supported Bolsonaro, and then flipped because of their habit of always siding with whoever is in power. It's an old Brazilian political tradition. There's more than 20 parties represented in parliament, and most of them just side with whoever's in power. But some of them are working to sabotage his government, preventing him from being able to pass legislation regulating social media. And because of that, it's all left in the hands of the Supreme Court, who are doing a pretty good job at it. But this process is not allowing any structural changes in how this information can be used to sabotage the electoral process. And at the same time that this is happening there's this full spectrum attack from the United States, from the Trump people and from Democratic Party affiliated extended state hegemonic media outlets like Washington Post and New York Times that are like attacking Brazil for freedom of speech issues. They're trying to frame criminals as people who are being victimized because of their political beliefs. And there's sophisticated PR attacks going on. There's this guy, Michael Schellenberger, came down to Brazil and collaborating with Glenn Greenwald and other people, Folha do São Paulo newspaper, which supported the military dictatorship, announced that they'd uncovered all of these emails showing that the Supreme Court was threatening to arrest Twitter or X workers for refusing to turn over personal data on, far-right influencers who had accounts with them. And then it was immediately debunked by the former Secretary of Digital Media from the Justice Ministry, Stella Arana, who remembered all the communications and proved that Schellenberger had cut and pasted a couple different emails to make it look like they were threatening X over a request to deplatform the grandson of former dictator Figueiredo, who's fled to Florida several years ago because of a fraud investigation against him, but who's like this far right social media influencer. What they were really threatening to do was arrest or prosecute. It was the Sao Paulo State District Attorney's Office threatening to prosecute people at X if they didn't turn over information on the leader of one of Brazil's largest drug trafficking gangs. What Schellenberger did was he manipulated cut and paste a bunch of different emails to make it look like it was this thing against, an order from the Supreme Court justice related to the grandson of the former military dictator Figueiredo, when it was an email from the district attorney's office of Sao Paulo. It was related to the leader of the PCC drug trafficking faction, But anyway, this made international news. When Schellenberger admitted that he did that it was a mistake, that didn't make international news. So he admitted he was wrong to the Brazilian press. That didn't make the American press.
Right. That's the problem with propaganda, right? When it's corrected, it's often hidden somewhere. But just to clarify on this point, so first of all, is this the Twitter files where there were quite a few? Matt Taibbi was also involved in that.
They branded it as Twitter files.
Twitter
They called
files.
it Twitter Files Brazil. So they
Right.
branded it as if it was this huge data drop of Twitter that was the Twitter files.
Right.
But they took like a dozen emails that were cut and pasted together to generate a false narrative and called it Twitter Files Brazil.
Oh
It's
my
a much
God.
smaller thing,
Wow. Okay, I did not realize that at all. I obviously did not see the correction myself.
Yeah.
But also, just to clarify another point, is this the same series of articles that was in August 2024? So in August of 2024, Glenn Greenwald, he co-authored a series of articles in Salvador, Sao
That's
Paulo
correct.
with
Yeah.
Fabio Serapiao, and I suppose Michael Schellenberger as well. And so it's the same one where he alleges that the Supreme Court Justice Alexandra de Moraes used the electoral tribunal outside normal procedures. That's the same series of articles.
Well, I don't think Schellenberger put his name on the byline of those articles, but those articles referred to the Twitter Files Brazil. And then also, I think in August 2024, there was the issue of the X ban, where
Right, yeah.
Brazil temporarily, Alexandre Moraes forced X off the air for like a month, until it agreed to comply with Brazilian law. And I think at that point, the Twitter Files Brazil thing was with Greenwald and this other journalist you mentioned, Fabio. I can't remember his name. I'd never heard of him when these articles came out. That was in April. And then in August, we had this situation where X was refusing to comply with Brazil's laws, specifically, for example, hiring a legal representation in Brazil. And so Moraes, the Supreme Court justice who's handling that individual case, said, if you don't comply, we're giving you 24 hours to comply by the law. And if you don't, we're pulling you down. And so X was pulled off the air for a month. And then a month later, Musk agreed to hire legal representation and it came back on the air. But Greenwald spun this all like it was this huge freedom of the press issue, freedom of speech, blah, 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 when really what he's talking about is freedom for billionaires from the United States to disobey laws in the global South, which is the real push that's going on from Silicon Valley. It has nothing to do with freedom of speech because you don't see Elon Musk and these other people protesting when the Trump administration delivers a list of 200 words that can't be uttered anymore in government agencies or cuts off funding for universities for allowing people to protest the genocide in Gaza. You don't see the Silicon Valley community doing that. Instead, in the case of Brazil, one thing that led up to an earlier near ban of X was when there was this neo-Nazi campaign to stimulate school massacres, which caused generalized panic in Brazil in April or May of 2023. And they're trying to get a series of school massacres to happen on Hitler's birthday. And so when the Justice Ministry asked for support from X initially said, oh, well, we support freedom of speech. We can't deplatform these Nazi accounts because it goes against our policy. But in Brazil, Nazism is a crime. like it is in Germany, or any kind of glorification of Nazism is against the law in Brazil. So what you're trying to say is that you want to bypass Brazil's laws, so that your platform can be used to stimulate neo-Nazi cells development in that country. That's a violation of freedom of speech if they ask you to deplatform Nazis when Nazism is against the law. It's a similar situation. For example, Germany has the same kind of legal framework. First of all, I don't know how far forward you want me to go into this freedom of speech stuff at this point, because I could go on about
Well,
this.
I will just say that you recently wrote an article entitled Trump, Musk, and the Hypocrisy of American Free Speech Absolutism, and warned that, like American progressives in the past, Brazilians who fall for this fairy tale will face a rude awakening if the fascists, whose rights they defend on principle, regain power. So I think this very much ties into what you probably were just about to talk about. And I'd love you to continue with that. But I wanted to say that quote because it is, I think, a very well written and quite scary and very insightful in that one sentence about what they could be facing if they just allow this false equivalency between hate speech and freedom of speech.
Yeah, okay, so I'm 57, right? I was a kid in Chicago when the Illinois Nazi Party decided to hold a march in front of the homes of Holocaust survivors in Skokie, Illinois. And a bunch of liberal Americans like the ACLU and stuff jumped in to defend their rights. It's important to know that they were still censoring books in the United States in the 1960s. So there isn't this long history of free speech absolutism in the United States. Pornography was illegal. Hardcore pornography was illegal in the United States until like 1971 or 1972. It's not a 200-year tradition that there's this kind of free speech absolutism. Free speech absolutism really started through the efforts of a few people, notably the Cato Institute, which was created by one of the Koch brothers or the Koch family, to try and make far-right politics cool again for young people in the early 1970s. So like libertarians, they built this new ideology, libertarianism, and one pillar of it is that we should legalize drugs, and another, we should legalize pornography, because freedom of speech is what America was built on, and blah, blah, blah. Because if we don't legalize, for example, rape pornography, then it's always going to come back and hurt the leftists the most, because when you start repressing free speech, then, it's a slippery slope. And so you had this situation in the 70s where there's a group created called NAMBLA, the National Association of Man-Boy Love, which published guides on how adult men could seduce 12-year-old boys. Then you had people like the ACLU defending them, defending their right. You had this convergence of these far-right actors, pedophiles, pornographers, and some liberals in the 70s, to the point where like Allen Ginsberg joined NAMBLA, for example. Like NAMBLA became fashionable with a certain segment of free speech absolutists. And, in most countries around the world, that is completely illegal. And I believe that it should be illegal. So there's a reason why there's NAMBLA in the United States. There's a reason why there's Nazi parties in the United States. And we've seen this whole thing escalate to the point where we're at right now in the United States, where the far right is still using free speech, to criticize other governments like China and Venezuela and Cuba and things like that as a geopolitical weapon in a situation where there's no real free speech in the United States. There's no free speech rights anymore, and there never really was, because even though the McCarthy era ended in the 1950s, if you ever put in the 1980s that you were a member of the Communist Party on your resume or something, you would never get hired, even though it wasn't official. I remember in the 1990s, if a Brazilian person, for example, my wife, wanted to travel to the United States, she had to sign a form saying she wasn't and had never been a member of the Communist Party. So they still weren't letting people into the United States who'd ever been members of any communist parties in the 90s. There's never been a moment where there's been an absolute right to free speech in the United States, and there shouldn't be. There shouldn't be free speech absolutism, because that implies that right is more important than other rights. And that's perverse, It's a kind of Christian fundamentalist influenced dogma with people who might call themselves atheists, applying all of that negative energy from centuries of fundamentalist Protestantism in the United States to some other issue, which in this case would be free speech. So you have a situation like, for example, in countries with newer constitutions like Brazil, and in some countries in Europe and other places around the world, they believe in a legal concept called the harmony of rights. What is a harmony of rights? There's a group of rights that are declared essential in the Constitution. Each one of these rights is of fundamental importance, but none of them can be used to deny another essential right. So, for example, you can't call freedom of speech to excuse yourself from spreading disinformation about the integrity of elections, because the right to free and fair elections is an essential human right in Brazil. The right to free speech doesn't supersede the right to free elections. If you're lying about flaws in the electronic voting system without providing any evidence whatsoever, as Jair Bolsonaro did on nationally televised press conference he held with over 100 foreign diplomats in August 2022 on the eve of the elections, then you violated Brazilian citizens' rights to free and fair elections, which is why the electoral courts barred him from running for office for 8 years based on that, right? Likewise, if you glorify pedophilia, then you're denying the rights of children in Brazil to live a happy, stress-free childhood. Okay? So that's why pedophilia and other types of speech are restricted in Brazil. And it's why the US extended state actor, Silicon Valley, with support across the political spectrum from these so-called democratic or so-called, but closely tied to the DNC newspapers like Washington Post and New York Times, are working together to destroy Brazil's concept of harmony of rights, because it opens the door for more profit for US corporations because they don't have to hire people to guarantee that their platforms can comply with local laws. And Brazil's a big country. They want to do it everywhere. They're already doing it all over the world. Brazil's big enough that it can say no, just like China, like Russia has, like Germany and other countries around the world that have some kind of values. So Brazil's like the biggest country in the global south that's standing up to these Silicon Valley oligarchs, which is why they want to make an example out of it, and it's why they're really interested in making sure that the Workers' Party doesn't win the next election. They're trying to figure out a way that they can support the impeachment of different members of the Supreme Court, but they're kind of also acting in a very ignorant manner because starting in 2019, all of the energy of the Brazilian far right and its supporters in the US far right and Glenn Greenwald has been focusing on one Supreme Court justice, Alexandre de Moraes. There's 11 Supreme Court justices. Most of these issues involving regulation of social media platforms have an overwhelming support from the Supreme Court. Like the last full vote I saw on one of these issues was like 9-2. So they can impeach Alexandre de Moraes. It's not going to change the outcome of any of these decisions. It's a strategic error. They're individualizing the Supreme Court. It's a structure. It's not one individual person. And if you remove him, they removed him. Now Lula would appoint another person. So they can't even really try to do it.
So that's really optimistic, I think, because as we know, Facebook, all these social media platforms are often used for color revolutions, around the world. And this makes me a little bit hopeful that they're aware of it. They're much smarter than me, but they're aware of it and they are putting in guardrails for that. But in terms of the right wing, in November of last year, you wrote, if the Trump administration seeks to destabilize Lula's government, it will likely work covertly to build a new alliance between the far right and the ruralistas, setting the stage for a parliamentary coup via an arbitrary impeachment process. And that, I'm quoting, this could spur the rise of a new neo-fascist tide across Latin America. Trump has obviously been in office for a very tumultuous 4.5 months. So are you seeing trends that substantiate your claim on this?
Well, what's happened is the following. The alliance is being made still. The Ruralista bloc, it's like the agribusiness connected lawmakers. And it's this very powerful caucus that spans almost all political parties. And it includes middlemen in international value chains connected to some of the most disgusting corporations in the world, like Cargill and Bayer, Monsanto, and things like that. What's changed is that there's a newspaper in Brazil, I think This is the one that where this article appeared, but apparently someone in the Trump administration told a Brazilian journalist recently that they're focusing on the 2026 elections. So there's not going to be an attempt to impeach Lula. All of the energy is going to be on defeating him in 2026. And it's going to be challenging, even though Bolsonaro is not going to be able to run. The mainstream media, which traces its roots back to the military dictatorship, which is very pro-United States, historically very pro-United States. For the United States, even a minimal amount of social democracy and sovereignty in Latin America is too much. Too much. They can't accept. It's a mistake for center-left politicians in Latin America to think that the US could ever be some kind of ally for them. It's never enough. They might temporarily align for their own self-interest. Like, for example, this moment when the Biden administration didn't help Lula take office. They didn't help him with the election or anything, but they just refused to engage in a military coup. That alone is very unusual for the United States. They refused to support a military coup. That's like one example of the US doing something positive in Brazil. The next most recent one I can remember is helping build a national steel industry in like the 1940s, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted to make sure that Brazil aligned with the Allies instead of the Axis. But it's very rare to have something like that happen. But that was very short-lived. And that was just out of political self-interest of the Democratic Party, because Bolsonaro was stupid in so openly aligning himself with one party. The Biden administration reached out to him on multiple occasions. They sent the CIA director down there. They sent Anthony Blinken down there. They tried to do business with Bolsonaro, but Bolsonaro, initially he refused to. He was the last world leader to officially recognize Biden's victory. And then he kept praising Trump. He kept saying he didn't think Biden won the election. And, so at some point, after about 3 years, it looks like the US government, the Biden administration, changed its tune and decided that they would rather have Lula win that election. But at this point, judging by the behavior of the New York Times and the Washington Post, they're definitely not supporting the Lula administration anymore. There's nothing in it for them. And I say that based on a series of articles pushing Bolsonaro's narrative about judicial overreach, authoritarianism in Brazil, attacks on freedom of speech, and a Washington Post article that came out like yesterday about this comedian who's been sentenced to 8 years in prison for telling racist, they put in bigot or whatever in scare quotes, jokes. It's a pretty big misrepresentation of what happened, especially since this guy's not going to jail for 8 years. But you can see this narrative's being built by the DNC as well, by their allied media. So I don't see much hope in getting any support. Anyway, they can't do anything now anyway. They can't do anything in 2026 to help the Workers' Party keep control in Brazil. And the main hope for Brazil right now is from its more important partners like China.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/EmpireWatch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.